Two names. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25 years old, from Ewa Beach, Hawaii. Private Isabella Gonzales, 19 years old, from Carrollton, Texas. Those are the two Americans killed in Jordan that triggered the strikes in this title. And before we talk about what the U.S. military did in response, I want you to know their names, because behind every headline about obliterating enemy forces sits actual people who didn't come home. Let's go through exactly what happened, what the U.S. actually hit, and what's confirmed versus what's just Iranian state media claiming otherwise. Welcome back to the channel. A quick background for anyone new here. I spent years flying the F-15E Strike Eagle in combat, flew the F-16 with the Air Force Thunderbirds, and these days I fly commercial jets, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Everything in this video comes from CENTCOM's own statements: Newsweek, Euronews, NPR, Al Jazeera, and the Washington Examiner. And where Iranian state media makes a competing claim, I'll name it as exactly that, an Iranian claim, not confirmed fact. Let's get into it. Muwaffaq Salti Air Base. That's where it happened. According to Newsweek's detailed reporting, Feehan was killed in action on July 18th, and Gonzales was killed during an enemy attack on July 17th, both at that specific base in Jordan. That same Newsweek reporting confirms this marked the third American military fatality in a matter of days, following the earlier Friday attack that killed 2 service members and injured 4 others, with a third American separately killed in Iraq on Saturday during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. A story I covered in detail in an earlier video on this channel. Muwaffaq Salti isn't a name most people outside military circles would recognize, so let me give you a little context on why American forces were even there. That base has functioned as one of the key American and coalition operating locations in Jordan for years, supporting operations across the wider region, and its role has only grown more significant throughout this current war, given Jordan's position bordering both Iraq and, at a distance, Iran's own sphere of missile and drone reach. Jordan hosting American forces at a base like this isn't a new development created by this war. It reflects a long-standing defense relationship, which is part of why an attack on that specific location carries weight beyond just the immediate casualties. It's a strike against infrastructure central to how the U.S. projects power and supports operations across this entire theater. According to the Washington Examiner's own detailed reporting on this specific attack, Iran used some of its most advanced ballistic missiles in Friday's strike on Jordan, a country the Examiner's reporting describes as more unprepared than its Gulf counterparts to defend against that kind of attack. That's a meaningful detail because it suggests Jordan's air defense network, while real and while it has intercepted plenty of incoming threats throughout this war, according to earlier reporting I've covered on this channel, may not have the same depth of layered missile defense that wealthier Gulf states like the UAE, Qatar, or Bahrain have built up, making it a comparatively softer target for exactly the kind of advanced ballistic missile attack that killed these 2 service members. That same Washington Examiner reporting adds further tension to this specific story, noting that in the aftermath of the attack, the U.S. was bracing for what officials believed would be further Iranian retaliation, specifically targeting Jordan's coastal city of Aqaba on the Red Sea, with the U.S. Embassy in Jordan actually urging its own citizens to avoid the airport or seaport there over what was described as a specific and credible threat. Israel's military spokesman separately warned of a detected missile launch toward that same city, cautioning residents that debris could fall on Israeli territory as a result. I think that detail captures something important about how interconnected this entire region has become throughout this war. A missile launch aimed at one country's coastal city generating a public safety warning in a neighboring country entirely, over debris risk alone. 25, 19. I want to sit with those ages for a second because I think it's easy to let casualty numbers blur into abstraction the longer a war drags on. A 19-year-old private and a 25-year-old first lieutenant are both, by any measure, at the very start of what should have been long careers and long lives. The Department of Defense's decision to publicly name them rather than leave them as an anonymous count is standard military protocol, but it's also, I think, the right call for how a story like this should be told. These aren't just data points in an escalation timeline. Now, let's talk about the response, because this is where your title comes in directly. According to that same Newsweek reporting, in response to these fatal attacks, the U.S. military launched retaliatory strikes on Sunday, specifically against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. CENTCOM's own statement, quoted directly in that reporting, said the strikes targeted IRGC coastal surveillance and air defense facilities, maritime capabilities, and missile and drone storage sites, as well as positions directly linked to the July 17th attack on U.S. forces. I want you to notice that specific phrase, positions directly linked to the attack. That's not a generic, broad campaign statement. That's CENTCOM explicitly saying this particular round of strikes was tied to identifying and hitting the actual forces responsible for these specific American deaths. CENTCOM's language gets even more explicit in a separate NPR report covering the same strikes. According to NPR, CENTCOM's statement said the strikes were designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and to swiftly punish Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces who launched attacks against American service members in Jordan. Swiftly punish. That's about as direct as military public language gets. This wasn't framed as a routine continuation of the broader campaign. It was framed explicitly and specifically as retaliation for these particular deaths. Let's break down exactly what got hit, because CENTCOM's own target categories tell you something real about how this specific strike package was actually built. Coastal surveillance and air defense facilities first. That category matters because it directly degrades Iran's ability to detect and respond to future American operations in the same region, not just punishing what already happened, but reducing Iran's capacity to repeat it. Maritime capabilities next, which ties this retaliatory strike directly back into the broader fight over the Strait of Hormuz that's been running throughout this entire war. And missile and drone storage sites specifically, the exact category of infrastructure that would have supplied the weapons used in the attack that killed Feehan and Gonzales in the first place. I want to walk through why that specific combination of target categories reflects a genuinely coherent military logic, not just a scattered list of things to blow up. Hitting storage sites for the weapons category actually used in the attack is a direct, traceable response. It's degrading the specific capability that caused the harm. Hitting coastal surveillance and air defenses makes any follow-up American operation in that same area safer and more effective going forward. And hitting maritime capabilities keeps the pressure on Iran's core leverage point in this entire war, its grip on the strait. That's not random escalation. That's a strike package built around punishing the specific act, reducing the odds of it recurring, and maintaining pressure on Iran's broader strategic position, all in a single coordinated operation. I think it's also worth explaining what coastal surveillance infrastructure specifically enables for Iran, because it's easy to skip past that category as a vague catch-all. Iran's ability to track American naval movements, aircraft launches, and troop positions along its own coastline depends heavily on radar installations, observation posts, and signals intelligence gathering facilities positioned along the Gulf Coast. Degrading that specific network doesn't just punish Iran for the Jordan attack, it directly reduces the intelligence picture Iran would need to plan and execute a similar attack again, which is exactly the kind of forward-looking, not just retrospective, logic you'd expect from a strike package, genuinely designed to prevent recurrence rather than just deliver a symbolic punitive blow. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and where I think careful sourcing really matters. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, Saturday marked the 8th consecutive night of U.S. attacks on Iran since the conflict was renewed this month. And separately, Iran's own nuclear agency said the U.S. had also struck the Darkhaven nuclear power plant site that same weekend. That's a detail worth flagging clearly. A nuclear power plant, not a weapons enrichment facility like Fordow or Natanz, being named specifically in the same round of strikes, though I want to be upfront that this specific claim comes from Iran's own nuclear agency, and I haven't found independent CENTCOM confirmation specifically naming that site in the sourcing available to me. I think that Darkhaven claim deserves a slightly deeper look because a nuclear power plant, as opposed to an enrichment facility, is a genuinely different category of target with different implications if it turns out to be accurate. Enrichment facilities like Fordow and Natanz, which I've covered extensively in earlier videos on this channel, are tied directly to weapons-grade material production, which is why they became the focus of that earlier, separate bunker buster campaign. A power generation plant is different. It's civilian energy infrastructure, and any strike against a facility of that type would raise the same kind of dual-use infrastructure concerns I've discussed regarding the bridge and power plant threats elsewhere in this war. Without independent confirmation of exactly what was struck at Darkhaven or what kind of damage actually resulted, I don't think it's responsible to draw a firm conclusion here. But I also don't think it's responsible to leave the claim out entirely, given that it comes from Iran's own official nuclear regulatory body rather than an anonymous or unnamed source. Now, let's talk about Iran's own retaliation to this specific round of American strikes, because it's genuinely important for understanding the full picture, and because some of what Iran claims here deserves real scrutiny. According to reporting from Iran's own state broadcaster Press TV, the IRGC announced what it called high fatality and widely destructive retaliatory strikes against American targets. Describing specific operations, it named the 21st and 22nd waves of something it's calling Operation Nasr 2. That same Press TV report claims the 21st wave destroyed 20 hangars used to station American troops in the Al-Azraq area of Jordan, and claims the deaths of, in their own words, dozens of American terrorist forces. I want to pause on that operation naming convention for a second, because it's worth understanding what it tells you about how Iran is managing its own public messaging throughout this war. Naming a sustained retaliatory campaign with sequential wave numbers, 21st, 22nd, and eventually up to a 40th statement according to later reporting, is a deliberate propaganda structure. It creates the impression of an ongoing, escalating, highly organized military campaign regardless of how much actual damage any individual wave produced. That doesn't necessarily mean nothing in those statements is true, but the structure itself is built for domestic and international messaging purposes as much as it is for accurately reporting battlefield events, which is exactly why independent verification matters so much before repeating any of the specific casualty claims embedded within it. I want to be extremely direct with you about how to read that specific claim, because this is exactly the kind of moment where careless repetition of a claim does real damage. Press TV is Iran's state broadcaster, operating as a direct instrument of the Iranian government's own messaging. And I have found no independent Western or Jordanian confirmation of dozens of American casualties in that specific strike. Compare that to the actual confirmed American casualty figures from this entire stretch of fighting, 3 deaths total, with names, ages, hometowns, and specific dates provided by the Department of Defense. A claim of dozens killed in a single strike, with no independent verification, no names, and coming exclusively from a government with every incentive to inflate its own success, does not meet the same evidentiary bar. And I'm not going to present it to you as though it does. I think it's worth explaining exactly why that evidentiary gap matters so much in practical terms, not just as an abstract principle. When the Department of Defense names a casualty, Feehan, 25, Ewa Beach, Hawaii, that's a claim that can be independently checked against Department of Defense casualty databases, against local news coverage in that specific hometown, against the family's own public statements, if they choose to make any. A claim of dozens of unnamed American terrorist forces killed carries none of that same checkability. There's no name to verify, no hometown to confirm, no independent record anywhere outside the claim itself. That structural difference, checkable versus unverifiable by design, is exactly why I apply a different evidentiary standard to each. Not because of which government is making the claim, but because of how falsifiable the claim itself actually is. That same press TV reporting adds another claim worth flagging with equal caution. According to a follow-up press TV report, the IRGC's 40th statement claimed its aerospace force struck a compound hosting American forces in the Al Rukban region of Jordan, again claiming unspecified casualties and specifically alleging that, quote, the U.S. War Secretary reported a casualty figure that was far below the actual number. I want you to notice what that specific claim is actually doing. It's not just claiming a strike happened, it's preemptively asserting that any official American casualty figure should be disbelieved as an undercount, without providing any independent evidence for that assertion either. That's a rhetorical pattern worth recognizing on its own, a claim structured specifically to be unfalsifiable, since any official American figure can simply be dismissed as understated according to the claim itself. I also want to bring in one more detail from that same reporting, because I think it's relevant to how you should weigh Iran's public statements throughout this entire war. That same press TV report noted the Pentagon has not held a major briefing on the war since May, according to a U.S. military official's own explanation, specifically because doing so could allow Iran to more accurately target U.S. forces in the region. I think that's actually a reasonable, honest explanation for reduced American public disclosure. Operational security around exact casualty and damage figures is a legitimate wartime concern, but it also means, and I want to be transparent with you about this, that the information gap this creates is precisely the space Iranian state media has been filling with its own unverified, favorable claims. Let's zoom out to the broader casualty picture for this specific round of fighting, because it deserves inclusion, even though it comes with the same sourcing caveat I've applied throughout this video. According to Euronews reporting, Iran said the latest U.S. strikes killed at least 50 people and wounded 517. I'm including that figure because, consistent with how I've handled every other Iranian-sourced casualty claim throughout this war on this channel, I think you deserve the human cost from both sides represented. But I want to be clear, this comes from Iranian sources, and I can't independently verify it. Exactly the same caveat I'm applying to the press TV claims about American casualties. I think it's worth being explicit about why I apply that same caveat evenly to casualty figures from both sides of this conflict, rather than treating one government's numbers as automatically more credible than the others. Both the United States and Iran have clear institutional incentives shaping how they report casualties in an active war. The U.S. has cited operational security concerns for limiting detailed disclosure, while Iran's state media has repeatedly demonstrated a pattern of using casualty claims as a messaging tool, as we walked through with the press TV reporting earlier in this video. Treating every unverified figure from either side with the same level of scrutiny isn't a false balance between two equally reliable sources. It's simply applying a consistent evidentiary standard regardless of which government is making the claim, which I think is the only honest way to cover a war generating this much competing, hard-to-verify information from every direction. I want to bring my own background into this for a second, because I think there's a specific point worth making about what swiftly punish actually looks like from an operational planning standpoint versus how quickly it can realistically happen in practice. Building a strike package that specifically targets positions directly linked to a particular attack, as CENTCOM described this one, requires real-time intelligence work, confirming which specific IRGC units, storage sites, or command nodes were actually responsible for a given strike, cross-referencing that against current battle damage assessments from the broader ongoing campaign, and then coordinating aircraft, munitions, and timing to actually execute against that specific, freshly identified target list. Doing that within roughly 48 hours of the triggering attack, which is what the timeline here suggests, reflects a genuinely fast intelligence-to-strike cycle, the kind of rapid targeting turnaround that's only possible when a military has already been running sustained operations in a theater for months and has deep current situational awareness, rather than needing to build a target picture from scratch. I think it's worth explaining what actually has to happen behind the scenes for that kind of 48-hour turnaround to be possible, because it's a genuinely impressive feat of coordination that doesn't get the attention it deserves compared to the strikes themselves. Signals intelligence and human intelligence sources have to be actively monitoring IRGC missile and drone units in close to real time. Satellite and drone surveillance has to be continuously updating target locations that can shift day to day. Legal and targeting review teams have to rapidly validate that a proposed target actually meets the rules of engagement and minimizes civilian risk. And then mission planners have to translate all of that into an actual executable strike package, assigning specific aircraft, munitions, and timing windows, all while that same military is simultaneously running its broader, ongoing nightly campaign against Iran elsewhere. Compressing that entire process into roughly 2 days, from the attack that killed Feehan and Gonzales to a named targeted retaliatory strike, tells you this specific intelligence and targeting infrastructure has been operating at a genuinely high tempo for a long time already, not something being built from scratch in response to this one event. I also think it's worth noting how this specific pattern, American troops killed, followed within days by a named, explicitly retaliatory strike package against the specific forces responsible, has become a recurring structure throughout this entire war, not a one-time event. I've covered similar retaliatory strike patterns in earlier videos on this channel, following the sea drone attack on Bandar Abbas, following the ship attacks in the Strait, and now following this specific attack on American forces in Jordan. Each time, CENTCOM's public language has shifted from its more routine degrade capabilities, framing toward more explicitly punitive language when American casualties are directly involved, which tells you something consistent about how this specific military leadership has chosen to communicate the difference between ongoing campaign operations and direct retaliation for American losses. That consistency across multiple separate incidents throughout this war is itself worth noting as a pattern, because it suggests a deliberate communications policy rather than an ad hoc reaction each time. Every single instance I have now covered on this channel where American personnel were directly killed, whether at sea, in the air, or on the ground in Jordan, has been followed by CENTCOM specifically naming the retaliatory strike as connected to that event, using language noticeably more direct than the routine, ongoing campaign updates that make up the bulk of this war's daily strike announcements. I think that consistency reflects a genuine institutional choice, treating attacks that kill named American service members as categorically different from the broader grinding campaign, worthy of their own explicit, publicly acknowledged response, rather than folding every loss into an undifferentiated running total. If you're finding this kind of careful, sourced breakdown valuable, that's exactly what I try to bring you on this channel, showing you what's actually confirmed, naming the people behind the casualty figures, and being honest about which claims deserve real scrutiny. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time and turn on notifications, because this specific cycle, attacks on American forces followed by named retaliatory strikes, has become one of the most consistent and most consequential threads running through this entire war. Let me give you my honest read on where this actually sits. As someone who's spent a career thinking about how a military actually responds when it loses its own people in combat, I think what's most significant about this specific round isn't really the scale of the retaliatory strikes themselves, it's how explicitly and specifically CENTCOM tied this particular operation to the individual attack that killed Feehan and Gonzales. That's a meaningful shift in tone from a lot of the broader campaign, And I think it reflects genuine pressure, military, political, and human, converging at the exact moment American service members are killed by name, in a way that abstract campaign objectives simply don't generate on their own. I think it's worth drawing a comparison here to how militaries have historically handled this exact kind of moment, because the pattern we're watching isn't unique to this war. When a relatively small number of named, individually identified service members are killed in a specific, attributable attack, military and political leadership consistently tend to respond with retaliation explicitly tied to that specific event, rather than simply folding it into ongoing campaign objectives, precisely because named losses generate a different kind of public and institutional accountability than aggregate casualty figures do. That's not a criticism of how this specific response was handled. If anything, it reflects a military taking individual losses seriously enough to build a dedicated, traceable response rather than treating every death as interchangeable with the broader war's overall statistics. I also think the gap between what's actually confirmed here, 3 named American deaths, a specific CENTCOM target list tied directly to the triggering attack, and what Iran is claiming through its own state media, dozens of unnamed American casualties across multiple unverified strike waves, is itself the most important thing for you to walk away from this video understanding. This war has generated an enormous amount of competing claims from both sides throughout its entire run. And I think the discipline of actually separating confirmed, named, sourced information from state media assertions, designed specifically to boost morale and project strength, is the single most valuable thing I can offer you as this conflict keeps unfolding. I want to leave you with one more thought about why this specific distinction, verified versus propaganda, matters more in this particular story than in almost any other thread of this war I've covered. When the topic is bridges, power plants, or even ship attacks, inflated claims are genuinely serious, but they're describing damage to infrastructure and to broader troop numbers that are harder to personally connect with. When the claims specifically involve dozens of named or unnamed American service members allegedly killed with no verification, that's a category of claim with the potential to cause real, specific harm to families anxiously searching for information about loved ones deployed in this region, to public trust in legitimate reporting more broadly, and to the actual historical record of this war once it eventually ends and serious accounting begins. That's exactly why I think it's worth taking the extra time in every video I do on this channel to separate what CENTCOM has actually confirmed by name from what a state broadcaster with an obvious incentive to inflate its own success has simply asserted. I'll be tracking this specific thread closely, and if there's ever independent confirmation of the broader casualty claims either side has made in this exchange, I'll bring you an update the moment that verification actually exists. If this video helped you understand both what actually happened and what's still just a claim, that's exactly the goal here, and I'd really appreciate you sharing it with someone else trying to follow this war, honestly. Hit subscribe if you haven't, and if you want deeper access, faster answers, and priority replies during live breakdowns whenever something major develops in this conflict, come join the Ready Room. Links in the description below. Drop your questions in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll pull the best of them into the next update as this keeps developing. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.